My name is Avery Thorne, and 3 weeks ago, I stood in the center of a gilded ballroom on a private island, surrounded by 200 people in black tie attire, and watched my own sister attempt to murder my soul with a microphone. They say that at high society weddings, the air is thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, but all I could smell was the ozone of an approaching storm and the metallic tang of betrayal. I am 32 years old, a trauma medic who spends 12-hour shifts stitching together the broken bodies of strangers. I am used to blood. I am used to the screams of the dying. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for the sound of 200 people laughing at the fact that I am a single mother. My sister, Sienna, stood on that stage in a designer gown that cost more than my annual salary, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured toward me. My sister Avery is a single mother, she told the crowd, her voice honey-sweet and dripping with a practiced, theatrical pity. Unwanted by anyone. A cautionary tale in a cocktail dress. The laughter didn't just ripple, it roared. It bounced off the crystal chandeliers of the Blackwood estate and echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. My mother, Patricia, didn't look away. She leaned back in her chair, a flute of vintage champagne in her hand, and tipped it toward the guests at her table. "She's a used product," my mother said, loud enough for the microphone to catch it. Her voice carried that sharp, New England aristocratic edge that can slice through steel. My father, the man who was supposed to be my first hero, didn't defend me. He didn't even look up. He just covered his mouth with a linen napkin to hide the smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. But the worst part, the part that I will see every time I close my eyes for the rest of my life, was my 5-year-old son, Leo. He was sitting right beside me, his small, warm hand gripping mine so tight his knuckles were white. He didn't understand the words used product or cautionary tale, but he understood the laughter. He understood that the people in this room, the people who shared his blood, were treating his mommy like a punchline. He looked up at me with eyes wide with a terrifying, sudden confusion, searching my face for the lie, hoping I'd tell him it was all a game. I couldn't speak. My throat had turned to ash. I was a trauma medic, a woman who could intubate a patient in a moving ambulance, and I was paralyzed by a girl in a white dress. But there was one person in that room who wasn't laughing. Julian Mercer, the man who was supposed to be Sienna's husband, was standing at the edge of the stage. He wasn't looking at the bride. He was looking at the little boy trembling in the chair next to me. And what he did next, what he said into that silence, it didn't just stop the wedding. It dismantled the Thorne dynasty in a single breath. To understand how I ended up at table 23, being mocked by the people who raised me, you have to understand the architecture of the Thorne household. Because in our house, there were never two daughters. There was a princess, and there was a workhorse. I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, a house that smelled of lemon polish and suppressed resentment. From the moment Sienna could walk, she was the Thorne jewel. She had the blonde hair that matched my mother's exactly, the effortless charm that made teachers overlook her skipped assignments, and the kind of beauty that acted as a universal hall pass. She was Daddy's little angel. She was Mommy's mini-me. And me? I was the responsible one. In the Thorne family code, responsible didn't mean admirable. It meant invisible. It meant I was the daughter who didn't need attention because I was expected to provide it. I was the one who cleared the table while Sienna practiced her debutante walk. I was the one who stayed up late studying for the scholarships my parents told me I'd need, while they set aside a massive trust fund for Sienna's lifestyle. The disparity was visible in the very fabric of our lives. When it was time for Sienna's prom, my mother took her to New York City. They spent a weekend at a boutique on the Upper East Side, emerging with a $5,000 gown, blush pink and hand-beaded. My mother looked at her like she was a religious icon. 2 years earlier, when it had been my turn, my mother hadn't even looked up from her screen. "Avery, you're the simple type," she'd said, her voice dismissive. "A flashy dress would just wear you. Better to stay in the background where you're comfortable." I wore a $63 dress from a clearance rack. I bought it with the money I'd earned cleaning the neighbor's gutters. I still remember the price because it represented 31 hours of manual labor, the exact amount of time it took to buy my way into a night where I was still an afterthought. Our bedrooms were the ultimate map of our value. Sienna had the corner room with the balcony overlooking the manicured gardens, furnished with white lacquered Italian sets and fairy lights that made her world look like a magazine spread. My room was at the end of the hall, squeezed between the laundry room and the utility closet. It was filled with the heavy, dark oak hand-me-downs from my grandmother's estate, furniture that felt like a burial. I didn't hate Sienna for it. Not then. I didn't know enough to realize she was the beneficiary of a psychological heist. I just wondered what fundamental flaw lived inside of me. Why did my parents look through me as if I were a pane of glass, while they looked at her like she was the sun? I didn't know then that this was a blueprint. I didn't know that my parents weren't just favoring one child over the other, they were grooming me to be the scapegoat for every failure Sienna would ever have. I was being trained to absorb the impact so the princess would never have to feel a bump in the road. And that training almost cost me everything the year I met Kevin. I met him during my second year of residency at Hartford General. He was a pharmaceutical rep, the kind of man who could sell ice to a polar bear and make the bear feel like he got a bargain. He was charming, he was attentive, and for the first time in my life, I felt like someone was actually looking at me. We married within a year. My parents came to the wedding, but they spent the entire reception talking to the guests about Sienna's upcoming internship at a firm in London. Sienna is the one to watch, my mother told a group of our relatives, while I stood 3 feet away in my wedding dress. Both my girls are doing well, of course, but Sienna, she has that it factor. She's the one who will carry the Thorne name into the next generation. The marriage didn't just fail, it imploded. Kevin's charm was a thin veneer over a deep, pathological need to control. He spent 3 years making me feel small, questioning my medical judgment, criticizing my appearance, and slowly cutting me off from the few friends I had left. By the time I found out he was having a multi-year affair with his regional manager, I was 7 months pregnant and had lost so much of myself I didn't even recognize the woman in the mirror. I remember the night I told my mother I was filing for divorce. I was 27, holding a 14-month-old Ethan in a cramped apartment I'd rented with my own savings. My mother didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer to help with the childcare while I worked the night shifts. She just sighed, a long, weary sound of disappointment. I always worried you didn't have the temperament to keep a man happy, Avery, she said. You're so clinical. Sienna would never let a man walk away like that. She has a certain grace you just never developed. My father said nothing. He just sipped his scotch and watched the news. Sienna sent me a single text, that sucks. But honestly, you always pick the wrong guys. Maybe try therapy so you stop being such a buzzkill. No one offered to help. No one checked on the baby. They treated my divorce like a clumsy mistake I'd made, a blemish on the family record that they intended to ignore until it went away. I survived those years on caffeine, grit, and the sight of my son's sleeping face. I told myself I didn't need them. I told myself that being the workhorse meant I could carry the world on my shoulders and never break. I was proud of my scars. I was proud of the fact that I heated up instant noodles at 2 in the morning after a 12-hour shift in the ER and never asked them for a dime. But then, 2 years before the wedding on Blackwood Island, Julian Mercer entered the frame. Sienna met him at a high-stakes charity gala, a world of black ties and hidden agendas. Julian was a children's rights attorney, a man who had made a career out of taking down powerful systems that crushed the weak. He was handsome in a quiet, rugged way, with eyes that seemed to see through the social masks people wore. The first time I met him was at a mandatory family dinner. Sienna wanted to show him off like a new piece of jewelry. He shook my hand, but then he did something no one in my family had ever done. He noticed Ethan. He saw the way my son was hiding behind my legs, and he immediately knelt down so he was at eye level with a 5-year-old. Hey there, Julian said, his voice warm and genuine. I like your dinosaur shirt. Is that a T-Rex or a Giganotosaurus? Ethan's face lit up like a Christmas tree. He started babbling about fossils, and for 10 minutes, Julian Mercer, the man the Thorne family was trying to impress, ignored the jewel of the family to talk to the baggage. Throughout the dinner, I caught Julian watching us. He watched the way my mother redirected every sentence back to Sienna's social calendar. He watched the way my father laughed at Sienna's vapid jokes but didn't even acknowledge the stories I told about the hospital. He watched the way I instinctively cleared everyone's plates while Sienna stayed seated, scrolling through her Instagram. Later, as I was loading my sleeping son into his car seat in the driveway, Julian appeared in the shadows. "Does it always work like this?" he asked quietly. I was so startled I nearly dropped my keys. "Does what work like this?" "The invisibility," he said. He wasn't smiling. "The way they treat you like you're the help instead of the heart of the home." I forced a laugh, that hollow, defensive sound I'd perfected over 3 decades. "Oh, that's just the Thornes. Sienna's the star. I'm just the supporting cast. It's no big deal." Julian didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. "You're a remarkable mother, Avery," he said. "And you're a hell of a lot stronger than they give you credit for. But being strong shouldn't mean being a punching bag." He walked back into the house before I could respond. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, the engine idling, my eyes burning with a sensation I couldn't name. It was the first time in 32 years that someone had looked at the Thorne family dynamic and seen a crime instead of a tradition. It was the first time someone had validated the workhorse instead of the princess. I should have known then that Julian Mercer was an investigator. I should have known that a man who fights for the rights of the unheard doesn't just marry into a family like mine without checking the foundations. But I was too tired to see it. I was just focused on surviving. Then, the invitation arrived. A heavy, cream-colored envelope with gold calligraphy that felt like a royal summons. "Sienna Marie Thorne and Julian James Mercer request the pleasure of your company at the Blackwood estate." The venue was a private island, a 5-star fortress of luxury. The budget was whispered to be north of $150,000, all funded by my parents. For context, when I married Kevin, they had given me $2,000 and a lecture on living within my means. The invitation came with a separate, typed note from Sienna. "Avery, please wear something understated. Grays or beiges only. I don't want any distractions on my day. And about Leo, if you absolutely have to bring him, keep him at the back. I've spoken to the coordinator, you're at table 23. It's near the service exit in case he has one of his episodes. Let's try to keep things classier than your last wedding, shall we?" I stared at that note for a long time. I felt the old, familiar weight of the workhorse yoke settle onto my neck. I told myself it was just one night. I told myself I'd wear the gray dress, I'd sit in the back, and I'd be the invisible daughter one last time. I didn't realize that Sienna wasn't just planning a wedding. She was planning an execution. She was planning to use the biggest stage of her life to ensure I never stood up again. And as I packed my bags for the ferry to Blackwood Island, I caught a glimpse of my mother's desk during a quick stop at the house. There was a folder labeled Plan B, the scapegoat clause. I didn't have time to open it. I didn't think I needed to. I assumed it was just another insurance policy. I had no idea that Plan B involved a hot mic, a live stream, and a secret Julian Mercer had been keeping since the night he met me in the driveway. I stepped onto that ferry thinking I was the help. I had no idea I was the evidence. The silence in the Thorne household was never empty. It was a pressurized chamber, a vacuum where my identity was sucked out to provide more oxygen for Sienna. My first marriage to Kevin wasn't an accident. It was the natural result of being raised in a home where love was a performance and attention was a currency I didn't possess. I didn't marry a man, I married a blueprint. Kevin was a pharmaceutical rep with a smile that was white, straight, and utterly hollow. He looked like the kind of success my father could understand, and for a fleeting, desperate moment, I thought that if I brought home a trophy, my parents might finally see the person holding it. Instead, I brought home a predator. Kevin didn't just want a wife, he wanted a project he could dismantle. Over 3 years, he performed a slow-motion surgical strike on my self-worth. It started with small observations, how my medical scrubs made me look unfeminine, how my stories from the ER were too intense for social gatherings, how I should probably let him handle the finances since my clinical brain wasn't suited for the real world. By the time I realized he was systematically isolating me from my colleagues at the hospital, I was already 5 months pregnant with Leo. I remember the night the floor gave way. I found the burner phone in his gym bag, hundreds of messages to his regional manager, a woman who didn't have clinical baggage or a tiring job. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He laughed. He told me I was lucky he stayed as long as he did, considering how low maintenance and drab I'd become. I walked out that night with a suitcase and a stomach that felt like it was full of lead. I went to my parents' house, thinking that even a colonial fortress might offer a port in a storm. My mother was in the parlor, sipping tea and scrolling through a digital catalog of yacht charters for Sienna's graduation gift. I told her through tears that it was over, that Kevin was gone, and that I was scared. She didn't put down her tablet. She just sighed, that long, weary exhaling of breath that always preceded a lecture on my own inadequacy. I always worried you didn't have the temperament to keep a man happy, Avery, she said, her voice like a chilled blade. You're so rigid. So medical. Sienna has a certain fluidity, a grace. She would never have let a man of Kevin's standing slip through her fingers. Honestly, dear, you're just a used product now. It's a shame, but you really should have been more careful with your investment. My father didn't even look up from his stock ticker. He just adjusted his glasses and muttered something about the legal costs of a mess like this. That was the moment the workhorse died and the survivor was born. I didn't ask them for a dime. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. I worked 18-hour shifts in the ER until my ankles swelled and my eyes burned. I raised Leo between daycare drop-offs and hospital rotations, heating up instant noodles at 3 a.m. while my son slept in a crib I'd found on the curb and scrubbed until the wood shined. I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor. I was the strong one, after all. And in the Thorne family, being strong meant you were the only one who didn't get a seat at the table. Julian Mercer didn't enter my life with a flourish, he entered it with an observation. It was 18 months before the wedding on Blackwood Island. Sienna had secured him like a rare specimen, a high-stakes human rights attorney with a pedigree that made my father's eyes light up with dollar signs. Julian was a man who lived in the world of high-tension negotiations and international law, someone trained to spot a lie in a room full of professionals. The first time he came to the house for a formal Sunday dinner, I was late. I'd just finished a grueling shift where I'd lost a patient on the table, and I walked in smelling of antiseptic and caffeine, carrying a crying 3-year-old Leo. Sienna was at the head of the table, holding court about her latest PR campaign for a luxury skincare line. My mother was hanging on her every word. My father was nodding along, already calculating the political connections Julian could bring to the Thorne name. Julian, however, wasn't looking at Sienna. He was looking at me. Not with the usual Thorne pity, but with a sharp, analytical curiosity. When I sat down at the far end of the table, my mother didn't offer me a plate. She just gestured toward the kitchen. The salad is in the crisper, Avery. And please, try to keep the boy quiet. Julian isn't used to domestic chaos. I started to stand up, the old workhorse reflex kicking in, but Julian beat me to it. He stood, walked the length of the long mahogany table, and held out his hand. I'm Julian, he said, his voice deep and steady. And you must be the sister who actually does the heavy lifting around here. The table went silent. My father cleared his throat. Sienna let out a forced, musical laugh. Oh, Julian, Avery's just the practical one. She prefers to stay in the background. She's an ER nurse, you know. Very, hands-on. Julian didn't look back at her. He sat down in the empty chair next to mine and looked at Leo, who was staring at him with wide, uncertain eyes. And who is this? A fellow paleontologist? He pointed to the small plastic triceratops Leo was clutching. For the rest of the night, Julian Mercer, the star of the evening, ignored the jewel and the patriarch to talk to the baggage. I felt my mother's gaze burning into the side of my head. To her, this wasn't an act of kindness. It was a breach of protocol. The workhorse was supposed to be seen and not heard, a functional ghost in the machine of their perfection. But Julian kept digging. He asked me about the hospital. He asked about the trauma cases. He asked about the hours I worked as a single mother. Every time my father tried to steer the conversation back to Julian's career, Julian would pivot, asking me for a medic's perspective on the social issues he was litigating. By the time the dessert was served, the atmosphere in the room was brittle. Sienna was vibrating with suppressed rage, her perfect smile looking more like a snarl. As I was packing Leo's bag to leave, Julian followed me into the foyer. "You're an auditor's dream, Avery," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm a nurse, Julian. Not an auditor." "No," he said, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You're the evidence. I've spent my life looking at broken systems, and I've never seen one quite as efficient as this family. They've built a whole empire on the back of your silence." "It's not a crime to be the responsible one," I whispered, the old defenses rising up. "Maybe not," Julian replied. "But it's a crime to make you believe that's all you are." He reached into his pocket and handed me a small, plain business card. No gold leaf. No Thorne-approved branding. Just his name and a private number. "If the pressure ever gets too high, Avery, call me. Not as a brother-in-law. As a witness." I tucked the card into my scrub pocket and fled. I didn't call him. I couldn't. To call Julian was to admit the Thorne house was on fire, and I was still the one trying to polish the silver while the smoke filled my lungs. The summons to Blackwood Island arrived in a cream-colored box that felt like it weighed 10 pounds. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a manifesto of Sienna's victory. The Blackwood estate was a private, fog-drenched island off the coast, a place where the elite went to hide their secrets and celebrate their status. My parents had spared no expense. They were buying Julian Mercer, and they wanted the world to see the transaction. The invitation came with a 3-page protocol handbook written by my mother. "Avery, you and the boy will arrive on the 4 o'clock ferry, not the 6 o'clock guest yacht. We need you on site early to help the florist with the heavy arrangements. Dress code, understated. Gray or beige. No patterns. You are there to assist, not to distract. Seating, table 23. It is located behind the pillar near the service entrance. This is for the boy's comfort, in case he becomes overstimulated." I read the instructions in my dim kitchen, the sound of the laundromat humming below me. It was a summons for a servant. I looked at the gray dress I'd bought at a thrift store. Modest, high-necked, a shroud for a woman who wasn't allowed to exist. But something else was in the box. Tucked into the silk lining was a smaller, handwritten note from Sienna. "Avery, don't try to play the remarkable mother bit for Julian this weekend. He's seen through it. He knows you're just the baggage we have to carry. Dad is finalizing the trust changes on Friday night. If you're a good girl and stay out of the photos, he might finally sign off on that apartment deposit you've been begging for. Don't embarrass me. This is my Plan B weekend. If you glitch, you're out for good. Plan B." I remembered the folder on my mother's desk. The Thorne family always had a contingency. If the princess was the investment, the workhorse was the collateral. I stepped onto the ferry on Friday afternoon, carrying a suitcase and a 5-year-old son, feeling the cold Atlantic spray hit my face. The island loomed out of the mist like a jagged tooth. As I walked up the stone steps of the Blackwood estate, I saw Julian standing on the balcony, looking out at the water. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched me struggle with the bags and the boy, his expression as cold as the sea. For a second, I felt a flash of terror. Had they finally gotten to him? Had the Thorne poison finally seeped into the one man who had seen me? I was ushered through the service entrance by a coordinator who didn't even ask for my name. "The florist is in the solarium. The boy goes to the staff nursery." No, I said, my voice cracking. He stays with me. Protocol, Miss Thorne, the woman snapped. Your mother was very clear. The boy is a Plan B distraction. He is not to be seen until the reception. I followed her through the maze of the mansion, my heart hammering against my ribs. As we passed my father's private study, the door was slightly ajar. I heard my father's voice, sharp and triumphant. It's all set, Julian. The script is written. We'll show the world exactly what kind of unwanted baggage we've been dealing with. By the time Sienna takes the mic, Avery will be a ghost. I froze in the hallway, the gray fabric of my dress blending into the shadows. I looked down at Leo, who was clutching my hand, his eyes wide with fear. I realized then that I wasn't there to celebrate a wedding. I was the lamb being led to the slaughter, and the knife was already being sharpened. But then, I heard Julian's voice, not in agreement, but in a low, terrifying whisper that made the hair on my neck stand up. You're right, Arthur. We're going to show the world everything. The fog didn't just roll into Blackwood Estate, it swallowed it. By Saturday afternoon, the mainland was a memory, and the private island felt like a floating stage adrift in a gray, indifferent sea. I stood by the service entrance, my hand stained with the sap of 1,000 white roses I'd spent 6 hours tethering to the grand staircase. My mother's protocol handbook had been literal. I was the help. I was the invisible labor behind the Thorne jewel's perfection. I watched the elite arrive. The senators, the dynasty heirs, the people who smelled like old money and cold ambition, as they were ushered through the front oak doors by staff who looked at my gray dress and moved me aside as if I were a piece of stray furniture. I had been instructed to keep Leo in the staff nursery, but the workhorse doesn't just follow orders when her foal is at stake. I kept him tucked into a small alcove behind a velvet curtain in the solarium, his little navy vest slightly wrinkled, his eyes wide as he watched the royalty of Connecticut pass by. Stay small, Leo, I whispered, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. Just for a few more hours. I wasn't just hiding him from the guests, I was hiding him from the Plan B I'd heard my father discussing. Every time my sister Sienna walked past, her veil trailing like a white smoke screen, she didn't look at me. She looked through me, her eyes already fixed on the microphone that sat waiting on the podium like a loaded weapon. Table 23 was exactly as promised, a setting tucked behind a massive marble pillar, so close to the swinging kitchen doors that the smell of seared sea bass and the frantic shouting of the catering crew drowned out the string quartet. I sat there with Leo, the gray fabric of my dress blending into the shadows of the stone. We were the distraction that had been successfully neutralized. I watched my parents at the head table, basking in the glow of 100 crystal chandeliers. They looked like gods of their own making. And there was Julian. He sat beside Sienna, his tuxedo fitting him like armor, but his eyes weren't on the champagne toasts. He was staring at the pillar. He was staring at the exact spot where he knew I was hiding. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge me. He just adjusted his cufflink, and I realized Julian Mercer wasn't here to be a groom. He was here to be a demolition expert. The ceremony had been a masterpiece of artifice. Sienna had cried on cue, the perfect, delicate tears of a woman who knew the cameras were at a 45-degree angle. But the reception, that was where the Thorne family truly excelled. It was a theater of cruelty disguised as a celebration. As the appetizers were cleared, the photographer began the immediate family portraits. My mother appeared at our table, her smile tight and sharp as a razor. Not this set, Avery, she hissed, her hand resting heavily on Leo's shoulder. We're doing the dynasty shots first. Just the parents, the couple, and the legacy. You understand. It's for the social pages. We can't have complications in the frame. I felt Leo's hand tighten in mine. Mommy, am I a complication? He asked, his voice small and brittle in the cavernous room. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just watched as the photographer physically moved us out of the background, directing us toward the service hall so the jewel could stand alone between her parents. I saw Julian watch the exchange. He stood perfectly still, his jaw locked in a way that made him look less like a husband and more like a judge waiting for the jury to return. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw the witness he'd promised to be. He wasn't just watching them sideline me, he was counting the cost. The heart-hitting peak didn't start with a scream, it started with a chime of a crystal glass. Sienna rose, her gown shimmering under the spotlights, looking every bit the princess my parents had paid for. She took the microphone with the practiced ease of a woman who had been given everything and earned nothing. "I want to talk about family," she began, her voice honeyed and amplified, echoing off the soaring ceilings. "And specifically, I want to talk about my sister, Avery." 200 heads turned. The spotlights shifted. The darkness of table 23 was suddenly incinerated by a blinding white glare. I felt the concrete of the ballroom floor turn into a trapdoor. "Avery is my big sister," Sienna continued, her smile widening into something predatory. "The one who taught me what not to do. See, Avery is a single mother. Unwanted. A used product of a failed life." The room didn't gasp. It laughed. A low, cultured, devastating chuckle that filled the space between the pillars. I looked at my mother. She was smirking into her wine. I looked at my father. He was nodding, his eyes fixed on the socialite at the next table, ensuring they saw how brave he was for tolerating a daughter like me. But then, I looked at Leo. My 5-year-old son was looking at the woman on the stage, his face crumpled in a terrifying, sudden realization that the world thought his mother was a mistake. The laughter grew louder as Sienna leaned into the mic, her voice dripping with a fake, theatrical pity. "She's our Plan B sister," Sienna laughed. "The one we keep in the attic so the rest of us can shine." I stood up. I didn't plan to, my body just reacted to the sound of my son's quiet, ragged sob. I was the trauma medic. I was the strong one. But as I looked at the 200 guests mocking my existence, I realized the scapegoat clause was finally in effect. My parents had planned this. They had scripted my public execution to secure their standing with the dynasty Julian Mercer represented. They thought they were finishing me. They had no idea they were just providing the final piece of evidence Julian had been waiting for. I felt the heat of the spotlight on my face, the salt of my own tears, and the crushing weight of 32 years of invisibility. I was ready to run. I was ready to grab Leo and disappear into the fog. But then, the laughter died. Not because of me. Because Julian Mercer had stood up. He didn't look at his bride. He walked toward the podium, his hand reaching for the microphone with a terrifying, calm purpose. He didn't look like a groom anymore. He looked like the man who had promised to be a witness. He leaned into the mic, his eyes fixed on my father's pale, suddenly terrified face. "You're right, Sienna," Julian said, his voice dropping into a register that made the crystal chandeliers vibrate. "We should talk about what this family does behind closed doors. We should talk about the Plan B folder I found in your father's study this morning." The room went cold. The silence wasn't just absolute, it was a vacuum. I saw my father try to stand, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over his scotch. "Julian, sit down," my father hissed, but the mic was already live. "I'm not sitting, Arthur," Julian replied, his eyes finally finding mine in the darkness. "And neither is the auditor I invited to this wedding. Because while you were planning a public assassination, I was busy looking at your offshore accounts." The big reveal was no longer a secret. It was a broadcast. And as Julian pulled a small, black remote from his pocket, the massive projection screens intended for the wedding montage flickered to life, showing something that wasn't a photo of the happy couple. It was a bank statement. And it was signed by a man who wasn't supposed to be on the island. Julian Mercer didn't just take the microphone, he reclaimed the air in the room. I watched from the shadows of table 23 as the man I thought was joining the Thorne dynasty effectively began to dismantle it. The laughter that had been roaring through the Blackwood ballroom didn't just fade, it curdled. It turned into that brittle, suffocating silence you only find in a courtroom right before a verdict is read. Sienna's hand was still outstretched, her face frozen in a mask of triumphant cruelty. She looked at Julian, expecting a kiss, a laugh, or perhaps a supportive hand on her waist. Instead, she found a stranger. Julian didn't look like a groom anymore. He looked like an apex predator who had finally grown tired of the game. He moved to the center of the stage with a slow, terrifying purpose, his shoes clicking against the marble with the rhythm of a firing squad. He didn't look at Sienna. He didn't look at the 200 elite guests who were suddenly clutching their glasses like lifelines. He looked directly at the pillar behind which I was hiding. He looked at Leo, whose small, tear-streaked face was peeking out from behind the velvet curtain. "I've spent 10 years litigating human rights abuses," Julian began, his voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that made the crystal chandeliers above us hum in sympathy. "I've stood in war zones and stared down dictators. I thought I'd seen every iteration of human cruelty. But I was wrong. I had to come to a private island in Connecticut to see the most efficient system of destruction I've ever witnessed. And it's sitting right here at the head table." My mother, Patricia, half rose from her seat, her pearls rattling against her collarbone. "Julian, darling, you're overreacting." It was a toast. A bit of family ribbing. Avery knows we love her in our own, complicated way. Complicated? Julian's laugh was a short, sharp bark of pure derision. "Is that what you call the scapegoat clause one found in your husband's private study this morning, Patricia? Or the way you instructed the photographer to physically push a 5-year-old child out of the frame so he wouldn't clutter the dynasty portraits? That's not complicated. That's clinical. It's the intentional, systematic erasure of a human being for the sake of an aesthetic." The room went cold. The kind of cold that starts in your marrow and stays there. I felt Leo's hand tighten in mine, his breathing hitching as the man who had talked to him about dinosaurs suddenly became the voice of truth in the center of the room. Julian reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, black remote. He didn't look at my father, Arthur, who was now clutching the edge of the table so hard his knuckles looked like white stones. "You invited me into this family because you wanted my pedigree," Julian said, turning to face my father. "You wanted the Mercer name to act as a coat of fresh paint on a rotting foundation. But you forgot one thing, Arthur. I don't just represent people. I investigate them. And when I saw how you treated Avery, the woman who actually keeps this family from hemorrhaging out while you play at being patriarch, I started wondering what else you were hiding." He clicked the remote. The massive projection screens behind the stage, which were supposed to show a montage of Sienna's childhood successes, flickered and died. A second later, they flared back to life. But it wasn't a photo of Sienna in a tutu. It was a digital scan of a bank ledger from the Thorne Private Trust. My father's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that I could hear even from the back of the room. "This is the big reveal, isn't it, Arthur?" Julian's voice was a whisper now, but in that silent ballroom, it sounded like thunder. "The reason you needed this wedding to happen today. The reason you were so desperate to secure the Mercer merger. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about Sienna. It was about the $42 million you've moved out of Avery's inheritance and into Sienna's lifestyle accounts over the last decade. Fraud is a heavy word, Arthur. But I think theft suits the Thorne family brand much better." The room erupted. Not into laughter this time, but into a panicked, frantic whispering. Sienna turned to Julian, her face contorting, the jewel finally showing the jagged edges beneath the polish. "Julian, stop this. You're embarrassing me. You're ruining my day." Julian finally looked at her. It was the look of a man disposing of a broken toy. "Your day, Sienna. You just called your sister damaged goods in front of her child for the sake of a punchline. You didn't ruin your day. You ended your charade." He turned back to the crowd, his eyes finding the red light of the professional videographer's camera, the one my mother had hired to live-stream the wedding. "And for those watching the live stream," Julian said, a dark, predatory smile touching his lips, "I've just sent the full unredacted audit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Thornes wanted a wedding the world would never forget. Well, congratulations. You're all witnesses now." I sat in the shadows of table 23, the gray fabric of my dress feeling less like a shroud and more like a uniform. The workhorse was still standing, but the princess was finally screaming. The Blackwood estate was no longer a palace, it was a crime scene. As Julian's words settled over the ballroom like radioactive fallout, the socialites and power brokers didn't just stay silent, they began to flee. It was a mass exodus of the elite, the sound of silk rustling and chair legs scraping against marble as the Thorne family's inner circle realized the ship was not only sinking but being boarded by the feds. I saw a senator I'd seen on the news a dozen times practically dive into the service hall to avoid being seen by the cameras. The Thorne dynasty was evaporating in real time, leaving my parents and Sienna standing on an island of their own making. My mother, Patricia, was the first to snap. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at the screens showing the evidence of her husband's financial heist. She turned her head slowly, her eyes searching the shadows of the ballroom until they locked onto the marble pillar of table 23. She didn't see her daughter. She saw the glitch that had ruined her masterpiece. She stood up, her champagne glass shattering against the floor as she began to walk toward me. It wasn't a graceful walk. It was the frantic, jagged movement of a predator that had been cornered. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking the last of the Thorne veneer. "What did you tell him, Avery? You've always been jealous. You've been waiting for this. You poisoned him against us." I stood up, pulling Leo behind me. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel the need to apologize for taking up space. "I didn't tell him anything, Mother," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I didn't have to. Julian is an attorney. He's trained to see the victim in the room. He just looked at me and saw the crime you've been committing since I was 6 years old." Sienna was on the stage, her veil tangled in her bracelet, looking like a ghost caught in a briar patch. "You ruined it," she screamed at me, ignoring Julian as if he were already gone. "You were supposed to be the help. You were supposed to sit there and take it. You're the strong one, Avery. You're the one who doesn't break. How could you let this happen?" The logic of the Thorne family was laid bare in that sentence. I wasn't a person, I was a load-bearing wall. My strength wasn't an attribute they admired, it was a utility they exploited. I was strong, so they could be weak. I was resilient, so they could be cruel. Julian stepped off the stage and began walking toward me, his hand reaching out to Leo. The 5-year-old peeked out from behind my dress, his eyes wide. Julian didn't look at my mother as he passed her. He treated her like a piece of debris left over from a storm. He reached us, knelt down, and looked Leo in the eye. "I'm sorry it took so long, buddy," Julian whispered. "But the dinosaurs are finally winning." He stood up and looked at me. "The boat is waiting at the private dock. Not the supply ferry. My boat. We're leaving." "Julian, you can't leave," my father's voice rumbled from the head table. Arthur Thorne had finally found his feet, though he looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He held up a thick, leather-bound folder. "Plan B, we have a contract, Mercer. The merger. The trust. You sign those papers tonight, or Avery loses everything. I'll liquidate her remaining medical funds. I'll sue for custody of the boy. I've already drafted the incapacity filings. If you walk out that door, I will destroy her." It was the final, desperate gambit of a man who had run out of lies. He was using my son as a bargaining chip. He was threatening to use the legal system he'd manipulated for decades to crush me one last time, all to keep Julian Mercer in the family. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the folder. He just pulled his own phone from his pocket and hit play on a recording. It was my father's voice, clear and cold, from 30 minutes prior in the study. "The script is written. We'll show the world exactly what kind of unwanted baggage we've been dealing with. Avery will be a ghost." "I'm an investigator, Arthur," Julian said, his voice like iron. "I didn't just audit your banks. I wired this entire estate for sound the moment the protocol handbook arrived at Avery's apartment. I have 40 hours of audio of you and Patricia planning the psychological destruction of your eldest daughter. So, go ahead. File for custody. I'd love to play these tapes for a family court judge. The folder slipped from my father's hand, hitting the floor with a heavy, dull thud. Plan B was dead. I picked up Leo, his small arms wrapping around my neck like a life jacket. I looked at my mother, who was now weeping, not for me, but for the social standing she'd just lost. I looked at Sienna, who was clawing at her silk gown as if it were burning her skin. And then, I looked at Julian. The boat? I asked. The boat, he confirmed. We turned our backs on the Thorne legacy, walking past the shattered champagne and the wilted white roses. We walked out of the ballroom, through the front oak doors that were no longer forbidden to me, and into the cool, gray fog of the Atlantic. But as we reached the stone steps leading down to the dock, Julian stopped. He looked back at the mansion, his expression darkening. Wait, he whispered. The live stream. It's still running. I looked back. Through the massive glass windows of the solarium, I could see the projection screens flickering. But they weren't showing bank statements anymore. They were showing a folder I hadn't seen before. A folder Julian hadn't mentioned. It was labeled, The Blackwood Inheritance, The Real Thorne Heir. Julian's face went pale. I didn't upload that, he whispered. I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my spine. If Julian didn't upload it, and my father didn't know it existed, who was still in that house, running the audit? I turned to look at the fog-shrouded tree line at the edge of the estate. A single light flickered in the old gardener's cottage, a place that had been abandoned for years. A figure stood in the window, holding a laptop. A figure I hadn't seen since the night of my first wedding. Kevin? I breathed, the name tasting like ash. My abusive ex-husband wasn't just a pharmaceutical rep, he had been a Thorne employee long before he was my husband. And as the screens in the ballroom began to scroll through a set of DNA results that made the $42 million theft look like petty larceny, I realized that the Thorne dynasty didn't just have a workhorse and a princess. It had a secret that was about to turn the strong one into the most hunted woman on the East Coast. The ballroom of the Blackwood estate had transformed from a cathedral of high society into a claustrophobic cage of cold, hard evidence. I stood at the edge of the stage, my son Leo's face buried in the crook of my neck, while the world I had been exiled from collapsed in a symphony of rustling silk and panicked whispers. Julian Mercer was no longer a groom, he was a silent executioner. He stood in the center of the light, the small black remote in his hand looking like a detonator. The projection screens behind him were still screaming $42 million in red and black ledgers, the literal price tag of my parents' betrayal. The big reveal wasn't just the money. It was the realization that my father, Arthur Thorne, the man who had preached the gospel of fiscal responsibility to me while I worked double shifts to buy Leo's shoes, had been systematically harvesting my grandfather's trust to fund Sienna's wedding and her firm that existed only on letterhead. Julian didn't stop at the bank statements. He clicked the remote again, and the ballroom air grew frigid. A recording began to play, not a toast, but a conversation caught by a hot mic in the Thorne study 3 hours prior. The script is written, my father's voice echoed, distorted and predatory. We'll show the world exactly what kind of unwanted baggage we've been dealing with. By the time Sienna takes the mic, Avery will be a ghost. She'll be so discredited, no judge will ever look at those trust discrepancies. The room went so silent I could hear the fog scratching at the windows. My mother, Patricia, didn't look at the screen. She didn't look at the federal audit Julian had just broadcast to the world. She looked at me. Her face was a mask of aristocratic rage, her pearls rattling against her throat like a warning. She stood up, her glass shattering against the marble, and began to walk toward me. It wasn't a mother's walk, it was the jagged, desperate movement of a woman who had realized her masterpiece had a terminal flaw. What did you do? She shrieked, her voice cracking the last of the Thorne veneer. You poisoned him. You've always been the workhorse, Avery, you were supposed to be the one who didn't break. How could you let him do this to us? I didn't flinch. For 32 years, I had been strong so she could be weak. I had been resilient so she could be cruel. But as I looked at her, I realized that being the Thorne workhorse was over. I wasn't a load-bearing wall anymore, I was the wreckage. I looked at Julian, who was walking toward me, his hand reaching out to Leo. He didn't look at my mother as he passed her. He treated her like a piece of debris left over from a storm. "The boat is at the dock," Julian whispered, his eyes locked on mine. "Not the supply ferry. My boat. We're leaving." I turned my back on the Thorne legacy, walking past the wilted white roses and the shattered crystal. I walked out of the ballroom, through the front oak doors that were no longer forbidden to me, and into the cool, gray fog of the Atlantic. But as we reached the stone steps leading down to the water, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone. A message from an unknown number. One I hadn't seen since the night I left my first husband. The workhorse was always the real heir, Avery. Look at the folder labeled Inheritance. You aren't just a Thorne. You're the owner of the island. The fallout from Blackwood Island didn't just break the Thorne family, it incinerated the very ground they stood on. Within 48 hours of the wedding, the federal audit Julian had triggered began to move with the cold precision of a tidal wave. My father, the patriarch who had spent decades manipulating the Greenwich social scene, was arrested at the breakfast table, still wearing a silk robe that my grandfather's stolen money had bought. The scapegoat clause he had drafted to ruin me had become the primary evidence in a multi-state wire fraud investigation. I sat in my small one-bedroom apartment, the hum of the laundromat below me feeling like a heartbeat. The screenshots of the family group chat were still saved on my phone. The digital receipts of their cruelty, the rehearsed lines of the unwanted speech, my mother's gleeful encouragement to make the roast funny. I looked at them and felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just a profound, hollow peace. I had spent 32 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was built on a foundation of theft. The digital aftermath was a massacre. The Thorne name was stripped from the hospital wings and the charity boards. Sienna's facade shattered so completely that she fled to a private villa in Europe, only to find that the credit cards, the ones tied to my grandfather's trust, had been frozen by Julian's legal team. She was a princess without a kingdom, a socialite whose only remaining followers were the federal agents tracking her travel. But it was the final big reveal that truly changed the math. Julian Mercer hadn't just been an investigator, he had been a silent guardian. 6 months after the island, I sat in his office in Manhattan, the city skyline stretching out behind him like a grid of possibilities. He handed me a leather-bound folder. "Silas, your grandfather, knew exactly what Arthur was," Julian said quietly. "He knew Arthur would try to harvest your inheritance for Sienna. So, he didn't just leave you money, Avery. He left you the Blackwood estate itself. The entire island was moved into a subtrust in your name when you were 6 years old. Your father has been paying rent to a trust he didn't realize you owned for 25 years. I stared at the deed. The workhorse wasn't just the survivor, she was the landlord. Every insult, every Plan B lecture, every moment of being told I was a used product had happened in a house that I legally possessed. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. I could have evicted them at 18. I could have ended the performance a decade ago. But Silas had waited. He had waited for me to be strong enough to see the crime for myself. I didn't sue for the $42 million. I didn't need it. I took the Blackwood estate and turned it into a trauma recovery center for women and children, a sanctuary for the invisible ones who had been told they were unwanted. I kept my job as a trauma medic, but now, I don't work double shifts to survive. I work them because I am the only one who knows how to stitch a soul back together. It is a quiet Friday evening, and I am sitting on the balcony of my new home, not a colonial fortress, but a glass-walled house on the edge of the Atlantic. The fog is rolling in again, but this time, it doesn't feel like a cage. It feels like a curtain closing on a play I no longer have to perform in. Leo is inside, his hair still damp from a bath, clutching a new dinosaur encyclopedia Julian sent him for his 6th birthday. There are no protocol handbooks on my desk. There are no scapegoat clauses. There is only a drawing Leo made today, a picture of two people holding hands. A mother and a son. No princess in the background. No patriarch at the head of the table. Just us. I received a handwritten letter from my mother last week. It was written on cheap, lined paper from a halfway house in Connecticut. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for a bridge loan. She asked if the strong one could do her one last favor. I didn't finish reading it. I didn't have to. I simply walked to the fireplace and watched the thorn-crested stationery turn to ash. For 32 years, I thought my worth was determined by how much weight I could carry for people who wouldn't even carry my luggage. I thought my value was tied to my resilience in the face of cruelty. But the Workhorse finally learned the most important lesson of all: real strength isn't about how much you can endure. It's about knowing when to put the load down. I am Avery Thorne. I am an ER nurse. I am a mother. And for the first time in my life, I am visible. Not because someone else looked at me, but because I finally stopped looking at them for permission to exist. If you've ever been the invisible one, if you've ever been the punchline of a family joke, if you've ever been told you're a used product, listen to me. The world might laugh, the spotlights might burn, and the people who share your blood might try to rewrite your story. But they don't hold the pen. You do. Walk out of the ballroom. Let the chandeliers shatter. Let the dynasty burn. Because once the smoke clears, you'll realize that the only person you ever needed to be wanted by was the person looking back at you in the mirror. And she's been waiting for you to come home for a very long time. Thank you for being part of this journey. If you've ever had to walk away from a family that didn't deserve your strength, drop a comment with the word visible. Let's remind each other that we are more than the roles they cast us in. Subscribe, hit that bell, and remember, the strongest thing you can ever do is choose yourself. I'll see you in the next story.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.